Hello, and welcome to the 17th episode of the Mike McNair Revolutionary Strategy Series. Today is Wednesday, the 10th of July 2019, and I'm your host, Tom O'Brien. This week, we continue our leisurely amble through Chapter 6, Unity in Diversity. The panel consists of the usual stalwarts, Derick Varn, Sophie, and Lexi Dog Robot. This week, I have the two new Patreons to thank: Anton Panakuk, yes, the Anton Panakuk no less, and Redneck Black Flag. You too can join the Patreon gang for only $5 a month, which works out at $1 an episode. I promise to have the vote on the next reading group series in the coming days, so it is a good time to sign up. For that, and the Patreon only episodes, of course, one of which will be shortly in the offing. If you'd like to comment on the show, please do so on the YouTube channel, and make sure to like, subscribe and share. You can also join me on Facebook or Twitter too. Okay, to the discussion.
Here's a question that I think it does kind of get into, where you do have to be sort of, where maybe the left-right spectrum of socialists doesn't really work. We would still consider the Stalinist, and I guess not the left communist, part of the left of communism, of socialism?
Well, it depends on what era of Stalinism. And this is actually something I think that this has in its favor. What era of Stalinism are we talking about? Because the thing that's consistent about Stalinism is the authority structure that they promote. It's not their electoral strategy.
Or even their economic content.
No, like the economic content is also different. It's the authority structure.
But maybe the singular axis is not useful. Because if it makes sense to stay with parts of the Stalinist left, even though they're destructive in records, but not the right for the same reasons, then it actually seems like special pleading for one side and not the other, so you can maintain some kind of big hen strategy. It really does.
The thing about this spectrum is that it makes the most sense when you're talking about the first and second internationals. The third international, and if you include the left comms of the third international, I actually think they're a little more continuous with this, you might say, orthodox tradition. Whereas the actual problems of Leninism and Marxism, quote unquote, in power really distort this whole legacy in a way that, you can't just collapse into the left-right spectrum.
Well, that to me also indicates that we're not dealing with the fact that our time might not rhyme with this at all. I mean, I know McNair talks about that, but it's something that increasingly I'm thinking about when we talk about this, because I'm like, but we can't act like, I don't know, the middle half of the 20th century didn't happen. It's
a big determinant on the kind of horizons people can see, because people see the potential for atrocity in any hope. Before, and will burn out on things before really giving them a shot. And
perhaps for decent reasons, to be honest. Yeah.
It's not about giving things a shot. It's about long-term patience and 100-year projects. That's what it's about.
I mean, I am honestly kind of more inclined to say that we shouldn't really bother with either Stalinist or the right. Yeah. I think for different reasons, but I don't know. I'm skeptical, and maybe this is a strategy that might work in might work in Europe, but in the United States, I don't see any viable way to push the right wing out of the Democratic Party. That is the party.
Right. I also don't. There's also no workers' movement to merge with, despite all the. This is another elephant in the room. Is a whole merger formula. You see a resurgence of guild union striking with teachers and stuff, and that's important. You are actually seeing real, honest to God, service sector unionizing attempts, which is great. Don't get me wrong. I'm not shitting on that. But you still are looking at the smallest portion of the labor force being unionized since there's been unions.
This book is definitely taking the long view and assuming that a process that has been constant to capitalism will reassert itself. There's a sort of Marxist leap of faith that this is a nadir of the labor movement, and that we're not just looking at the new normal totally.
I do think strategy of patience is probably one of the best things about all of this, to be honest. I don't think we should abandon the strategy of patience. at least in America, we should focus our efforts on using the McNair scale on a coalition of the center and the left, rather than bothering with Stalinists or the right.
But what's the center? Because the center in America right now is full of Stalinists.
Well, that's sort of the thing. So we take on that left and right axis for strategy. And then within these people that accept this strategy, we call out for different reasons, for reasons that are related, but not like subsumable into the one axis. We have to make another break. It's not enough just to take this on. Although
the other issues is like the far left, like left communist and otherwise. I mean, yes, you have anarcho-communists who'll join the DSA and for some reason be friendly with Maoists, because that seems to happen a lot.
American New Left, you know?
Most of the left won't play ball at all. So even right now, when you have like communizers entering the fray with the DSA, which is nutty, there's still a core of like principled left communists who like won't talk to anybody. And I'm not talking about trots. They're like, no, until like we have the workers' movement, emerges spontaneously from meat rotting or something, like maggots.
Yeah, I'm not going to do anything. We're not going to say anything.
We're just going to sit here like cultivating our communist militants until the great moment happens. Our tendency, our current can emerge, and like you can't do anything with those people because they don't play ball.
That's kind of, I think, like to address the issue of like there isn't really a center now, like besides Stalinists and Stalinist sympathizers. I think that's where the patience comes in, and we have to slowly talk to people and try. I hate saying build our bases, but we have to do something to get ideas out there. You know what I mean? We can't force people to become centrist or whatever. It's just through the slow work of organizing, I think, is how you can build that up. I think the best hope in any of people we would call left in the context of this book was probably with the more principled anarchists who aren't weird Maoists in the closet, or who are willing to. There are some who are willing to play ball. That's a lot of my friends, really.
I think in the terms of American politics, though, we have to remember that they had a dominant moment, not only like as little as 9 years ago, that its failure is why there are so many Marxists. Like Marxism in America was like an antiquarian society filled with former Trotskyists and a few people who beat off to Soviet memorabilia. That's not the case anymore, but it's largely because the anarchists failed in Occupy, whatever vague whateverness they were trying to do. That hasn't been dealt with in our context either. And yet, in a way, it sort of proves your point, Sophie, because that is where the core of Marxism currently comes from, is a bunch of people who are anarchists before 2012.
Even for those anarchists who don't become Marxists, a lot of them do realize that, Occupy and the anti-globe movement, failed, and it sucked. I crack jokes with them about some of the ridiculousness of Occupy all the time. I guess what I'm trying to say is that compared to right-wing social democrats and Stalinists, there are some anarchists out there that are worth talking to, I think.
Well, I agree, but the thing is, I know more anarchists in coalition with the DSA than they are with even centrist Marxists. I mean, that's also just kind of an objective fact. John Michael Cologne, Libertarian Socialist Caucus, is one of the largest caucuses within the DSA. I don't get it either. I don't really understand how you justify it, but that's where we all are. And when I actually go to DSA meetings, and I now do so regularly, who they end up working with are former Democrats turned Maoists. I don't think out of ideological necessity. I think those are the people who actually do things other than reading groups.
Was Marx did he not have his own Stalinists in his day? Did he not have the Blanquists?
There's the kind of Blancist leftists, but there's also the Lassalleans, and their organizing tradition is kind of where, from what I understand, democratic centralism comes from, and where the whole culture, genuinely somewhat authoritarian structure of even the good old days of German social democracy. It metastasizes under the Russians, but it comes from there. It's not like that They were just,
a lot of people
as democratic as they make it out to be.
It's funny because a lot of anarchists and like autonomous Marxists will blame that on Kautsky, and it's like, no, that goes back to Lassalle, and that was in the culture of the SPD, and Marx accepted it but criticized it. One of the things that I have been flirting with recently is trying to bridge what I know from like Das Kapital and Marx's writings with what I know about his actual history in these parties, and also like the fact that for a long time Marx basically said, like, I mean, basically since the failure of the liberal revolution in 1858 and a lot of the parties didn't pan out, he's like, I'm just gonna hide in the library until like there's an actual party that I can play with. And then when there was such a party and he had to deal with them, he didn't always, like, what he did in the party context and what he actually thought were not consistent. And I don't think people deal with that. Honestly, that division leads to like Althusser's pseudo-epistemological break and all that, because it's hard to square. It is a little bit hard to square some of the political actions and some of the stuff he did on programs.
Yeah, okay, so explain these things. Explain these differences then.
Well, one, the most important document for what Marxism means by socialism was not published in his own time because it would have been politically disadvantageous to do so. And he censored it. The Critique of Goethe program. The Critique of Goethe program itself has concessions to things that seem, if you read free capital, don't necessarily make total sense. Like, so one of the things that I pointed out is while you can use the Critique of the Goethe program to fight rightists, it actually does make a lot of left communism untenable, because the idea, for example, is the total abolition of value happening all at once. That's not something that Marx argues for, and it's actually clear in the Critique of the Goethe program. There are clear stages, and there's like the remnants of bourgeois society for quite a while.
Look, it's an intermediate text on a lot of grounds, but
I mean, it kind of hits everybody, honestly. If you really read it closely, it's been something I've been thinking about. And so, but Marx suppresses it, so because that would have, he thought that was released, it would have destroyed the SPD. And for all the shady stuff he said about Lassalle, he wasn't willing to risk that. So in a way, Marx was more willing to deal with the rightist. At the same token, he also took his ball and went home a whole damn lot. There's long periods where he's like, well, I'm going to go hang out in the library because there's nothing you guys are going to do that's going to be of any importance at all. Bye.
He wasn't wrong. He wasn't wrong.
So, I mean, like, yes, he was in the party with these people, but he wasn't doing anything with them. He was hoping that maybe they come to their senses later, I think. I mean, we don't know actually what he thought. We got snarky letters between him and Engels that he didn't want public. And like very inconsistent attitudes where, like, in 1 year he's saying something horribly racist about Lassalle, and then when he dies he cries. I mean, like if you try to read this as a totally clear and consistent political theory of Marx, you don't get one. And I think that's why, honestly, everybody goes to Lenin, because Marx didn't explain his political thinking. He never got there. Like, if you read Hal Draper's excellent, huge thing on Marxist theory of revolutions, you find out that capital is supposed to be the first part of explaining the entirety of bourgeois society. So, like, the anti-economistic people actually do have a point that Marx's vision was much, much larger than that. But he never got to any of it because it was too big. There was too much to do. We don't know what his actual political theory would be, beyond the fact that we have that, like, our best text for that are the Critique of the Goethe program and the Brumaire, which is a piece of journalism. So,
could we get all of his writings and we could put them into like an AI and get them to formulate our strategy?
Oh yeah,
I have a feeling that we're not going to like what comes out. It's just a hunch, but.
I mean, I do think it leads to people like positing stuff, like, in all seriousness, like, like, I swear to you that a mutual friend of ours, who I won't name because I don't want to shame him, like, really does seem to believe that, like, a supercomputer is the only way to do this, because it would be the only way to abolish value fast enough.
I mean, in terms of like a broader theory where revolutionary agency can, apply this stuff, that seems plausible, but I don't think that's how you mean it.
The chicken or the egg on all this doesn't seem to have been worked out by anybody. My point here, though, is that I think that's why you can't not deal with Lenin, and why everyone goes to Lenin is because you don't actually get a lot of clear answers in Marx. In Engels, you get more than Marx does. I mean, Engels is actually probably, frankly, a less acute philosophical and economic thinker, but actually a little bit more acute of a political thinker.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that. And he's more understanding of the American situation as well, so he's more useful for my analyses of my own society, you might say.
Yeah, well, his letters on America are like way icky. And as opposed to Marxist, he's like, well, the bourgeois party, will develop into socialism because he's seeing the radical Republicans as hope. Because our oppositional parties. So you compare our bourgeois political tradition to Britain's, right? And the difference is there's no landed gentry party. There is the bourgeois party that has some yeoman characteristics and thus is populist, aka the Democrats, and there's a bourgeois party of large-scale of capital proper, aka the Republicans, and the Republicans become less progressive over time if capitalism develops, and the Democrats become more schizophrenic as the sectors of other parts of bourgeois society get subsumed into it and they don't make any sense as an allegiance. So that doesn't mirror in the European politics, but that's also, we didn't have any feudal thing to overcome. We had our own weird bullshit. But it makes me wonder, like, in some degree, and I don't mean this in like a negative, like, oh my God, this is racist sense. I mean this in a literal sense. Is this book so Eurocentric that it's not useful globally?
I think, broadly speaking, that this is at a high enough level of abstraction that, like, the fact that we're in, a settler society that was, like, born out of an anti-colonial revolution, and therefore we don't have that exact feudal dynamic. This many years down the line, I don't think that's that important. I actually kind of think the broader characteristics of capitalism structure the limits of what things, like what kind of strategic options we have, what our choices are, period. And so, on that level, I think you can still take this framework. But, I think you can take the framework. I don't know if you go with the strategy that he advocates.
Yeah, so let's talk about abandonment then, because this might tie up some of this. You want me to read it, Tom?
Hit it, Derick. Hit it.
This conception was, in fact, very rapidly abandoned. The socialists, including their lefts, proved unwilling to enter into agreement for the common action with the communists on these terms. The initial result was a period of zigzags between unity with elements of the left socialist and trade unionist on the basis of self-censorship of the communists in order to fudge the political differences between them, and the simple denunciation of the left by communists and the isolation of the communists.
Like, a lot of my friends who I used to organize with kind of have this idea of, not with the Democratic Party, but with more liberal groups that are doing, like, actually good work, in particular, like, around a group that helps migrants get to, their next destination who are being dropped off here. And I like that work, but I think one of the things that, like, kind of bugs me, and it was something that bugged me about Redness Revolt that I tried to justify, was this kind of this fudging that happened, right? Like, that people were hesitant to describe themselves as revolutionaries or kind of downplay these differences. And I justified it to myself by saying, well, they're just describing the concepts without using jargony buzzwords that will scare people off. And with Redness Revolt, that was true to a larger extent, I think, because it was explicitly anti-capitalist, anti-nation state, etc. But I just kind of worry that, like, maybe my friends are watering themselves down too much when they're interacting with people doing this important work. And it just kind of is like this weird parallel where almost the strategy makes more sense in kind of like activist work with different orgs that are generally, like, liberal versus doing it with the Democratic Party. But then, do you fall into these same trappings?
Well, here's the thing with the activist work, you have something much more clearly to unify around that you could suppress opinions about for. And not the suppression of opinions is a good thing, but you have a clear agenda. When it comes to, like, socialism and the Democratic Party, I'm going to be frank, like, even the left, quote unquote, even the Marxist left and the Marxist center, we don't agree on what it is. So we can agree on helping out immigrants. We can agree on doing certain mutual aid projects. We can agree on stopping police from being able to search cars by fixing brake lights. We can all agree on that in a very activist-y way. Even if you picked a group that was somewhat consistent and kind of small, like the ISO, RIP, by the way, you would not get the same answer on what socialism was remotely. And they had a program, which they strategically ignored, but they had a program. The issue that I got from thinking about this in the Trotskyist context is in a way like the problems of the United Front strategy does lead you to the Popular Front strategy, even when you don't call it that. Because I'm not going to lie, in the case of the ISO and the IMT and a lot of these other groups, and they're going to get mad at me for saying this, but they would just completely drop critiques they'd have for decades and run in the opposite direction so that they can maintain comrades' irrelevancy. Yeah, that's that zigzagging, and that's Popular Front shit too. So the difference becomes almost irrelevant in practice. I don't know how you fix that unless you have a very clear definition of what you mean by socialism, but that in and of itself would split immediately. And so I get kind of pessimistic. I actually like talking to Tom because Tom revives my hope at all for anything. Where I get all sackcloth and ashes and I'm just gonna hang out in the mountains while the world falls apart. But
Derick, then I bring you right back down with a good insult. So it's kind of you're left neutral, you're left right back at square one.
You're both the base and the acid. You just end up being fucking water. Oh man,
my father once got covered in caustic soda. He'd run home.
Oh shit!
Oh god!
And ran through the house. We were watching him running through the house. Why is he running through the house, stripping his clothes off?
No!
Oh god!
Actually, and this has nothing to. Well, maybe it does have something to do with caustic soda. We'll get to that in a minute. And I actually want to read the next two paragraphs. An example of the other confusion about how to apply the United Front policy can be found in the case of the relationship between the British Communist and the trade union official lefts, and that between the Soviet trade unionist and the General Council of the TUC in the run-up during the 1926 general strike. Both the party and the Comintern zigzag between promoting illusions in the official left and denouncing them. And a range of failures of the same period are discussed in Trotsky's Third International after Lenin. In the late 1920s saw an abrupt shift to the left in the Soviet Union, the turn to class struggle in the countryside and forced collectivization, and in the Comintern. And in the place of the United Front policy, the task of communist parties were now mainly to fight against the other socialists, aka this is the third period. This turn was justified by the fact that the world situation, having passed through a period of post-war revolutionary crisis and a period of stabilization in the mid-1920s, was now entering a third period of open crisis. Trotsky called the new policy the third period of Comintern errors, and the expression the third period as a description of the dead-end sectarian isolationism had struck. This policy continued until, in 1933, it met an utter disaster in the Nazi coup in Germany. And I want to bring this up because I've always been fascinated about the third period, and here's why. The third period analysis of who actually made up the majority of the political leadership of the fascists was actually more correct than Trotsky's. The results of that, applying that strategically, were disastrous.
Oh yeah.
So what do you do? Yeah. Because the analysis actually was more correct. The results were more damaging.
I actually 100% agree, but that's the whole problem that McNair is chewing through. How do we get out of zigzag mode there? Because that is true about the national bourgeoisie, and that is true about Lassallean socialism. It is kind of fashy. It is sort of basically those same energy. It's the same class forces at work. And it could easily go in that direction again. They're not the good guys. This is conservative socialism. This is the thing Marx was fighting. It's not Marxism. That is true. But how do you deal with this?
Right, because if you denounce the Social Democrats totally, then the right literally gets to slaughter them, and you do nothing.
You can't allow that. This is why I like this book. This book is really trying to answer hard questions. I think this is maybe one of the weaker points in the book, frankly. I think that his overall framework, his historical analysis, pretty much spot on.
Yeah, could you clarify a little bit there why you think this is the weakest bit? Like, what particular about this analysis of the United Front?
It's not so much the analysis, but what he kind of says towards the end, which is
the conclusion. Which is the conclusion. I think you actually agree with a lot of the problems that pose. Right?
Like the analysis is excellent, but like what he proposes to do about it. But this is also the one flaw in the analysis, at least insofar as it works for us, is something that we can double back to, because it's in the 4-point thing on Trotsky. It was Trotsky's 1922 report on the United Front. This is page 105. He's got a few good points that he draws out from here. The first thing he says, though, the question is posed of a United Front because the right wing still lead broad masses. The United Front is not a permanent concept, but a road to a higher form of unity in which the unity of class is expressed in the Communist Party and the Comintern. Now, this idea that the right wing still leads broad masses is directly challenged in the way working class participation in electoral politics now functions.
Meaning?
It does it. They don't vote.
Yeah, in America, Pearls don't vote, really.
In most countries where democracy isn't compulsed, they don't vote. It's not just the U.S. either.
It's just not there. Like, they kind of know that this isn't for them. This is for the managers. It's a truly depressing situation. It's an anti-democratic situation, regardless of whatever formal mechanisms there are. It systematically distorts, what would be popular will.
Does it? In
the United States, for sure.
But look at a country like Australia where it's compulsory voting.
Yeah, and it doesn't change much.
It doesn't change much.
It doesn't change much either. And it points to, there's an underlying cause to that. It's not literally the fact that they're not going to the polls. It's that there's a loss of faith in the ability for these institutions to actually represent popular will, and that participating in them is fruitless and illusory. There's a great nihilism about these institutions. It's hard to overstate. It's probably the biggest thing in American politics that stands out. I'm sure this is the case in other places, but I can't really speak for that. It seems very much like the overwhelming value, the value of associating with these things when you're so powerless and they're so odious is vanishing. There's even something towards the end of this where Trotsky talks about when you're very marginal and you're associating with something very powerful and how the dynamic is basically different. And I don't wonder if we're in that set of conditions. I actually think all these points are worth going over.
Let's do number 2 then, because we must have skipped ahead. The idea of the Workers' United Front. This has 2 aspects. One, it is a unity of the working class as a whole in action for elementary common interest, i.e. including anarchists. It is not merely an electoral or parliamentary combination of communists and socialists. It is counterposed to left unity that includes liberal parties such as the Cartel de Gauche and to the SPD's post-war coalition policy.
So I think this point is kind of what I was trying to get at earlier, where based on what Lexi and Derick were talking about as far as how toxic and how little faith people have in the electoral system, that maybe any kind of Workers' United Front shouldn't really be about electoral politics at all. And I'm not saying don't ever participate in electoral politics. I'm not a left communist in that I believe that is always bad or whatever. But I think the situation we're in now, it doesn't make much sense to me. I mean, maybe it makes a little bit more sense in European countries, but even then, based on what Derick was saying, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of faith in any of these liberal bourgeois institutions anymore, and I think for good reason.
It's interesting to me, actually, as a side note, Lexi, about how, and maybe this actually supports one of Tom's points that I don't know if he made it on air when we were arguing off air, that people don't understand this, because this book is often seen as a call for left unity itself. I don't know that it actually really is.
It's probably best described as sect unity.
Yeah. The question that I find interesting is that point 2 also actually follows from point 1, but we've already said point 1 doesn't apply in at least the United States and maybe a lot of the world. like the idea of a workers' united front could only make sense if the workers were already engaged in both electoral and non-electoral politics.
Right.
But if there is no engagement with either, I mean, there might also, what does non-electoral politics mean if you're not actively overthrowing your government, right? Like, I mean, it does mean something, but it's vague.
I'm honestly, the only thing that I can think of in these conditions is you have a sort of, and this obviously goes into dangerous territory, but like the only thing you can do with elections is, in the United States, our institutions are always portrayed as sanctified and holy and good in some way. And you can't really attack these things with more good. You need some level of irony and some level of, like, I don't know, honestly, like a sense of like revenge against the political class to really animate anything like, you know, a working class base. And
which unfortunately has been mostly ceded to the right, at least in the United States.
And increasingly throughout the world, this cuts right. And considering that this is our current class political situation, it's pretty vital that we figure out a way to channel this into some kind of electoral expression that can attack in some way, like the military state, capital, these sorts of things, at least on a propagandistic level. I don't see what prevents something like this from happening in a society. I'm not so much a structuralist where I think that nothing like that is possible. There has to be some way to do something very spiteful to this walled garden of managerial interest.
And so let's look at the point 3, because so far, if we've rejected the point 1, thus point 2 doesn't stand, although we might still agree with point 2.
I still think that, yeah, B stands.
B stands, and A would stand if point 1 was true, but doesn't stand without it being true.
It might be the case that anarchists have the same problem as a lot of other political actors, and that we would also want to avoid them. But I'm not going to say that I totally agree with that.
You have a point.
Provisionally, like, you know, I could accept one or the other, honestly.
Well, I gotta ask you. I mean, this is where I'm gonna sound like a douchey Marxist. Anarchists in the early 20th century context had specific, like, objective goals that made sense, involving like agrarian labor and stuff like that.
That's a good point.
Anarchists in the late 20th century is largely an ideological position. And while they do have specific goals, like there's not one or two, there's not a clear set of consistent material interests between anarchist groups that I could generalize in a way that doesn't make them just as open to being weirdo politicos as everybody else.
Right.
You're 100% right, Derick.
Yeah, I guess I'd say this, is that the best anarchists that I know are basically just go through in microcosm the process that Blancist conspiratorial socialism did towards like Marx. And like just as a personal project, they go beyond anarchism because they take the goal so seriously. That's really what Marxism is at the end of the day. Like if you really wanted a society with like the minimum of hierarchy, you would have to think about class and you would need to, you know, address that. Like,
right, that makes sense.
They get driven into the same stuff if they're thinking clearly. And if not, it could be virtuous, but very often it's just because they're hipsters and like kind of subculturally interested, you know.
So let's go to point 3 then. It is the chief and categorical condition, and that's in quotation marks, that the Communist Party must retain autonomy and independence and its freedom to present its own views and its criticism of those who oppose communists. Yeah, I don't think any of us would object to that. Although what that means right now is a little bit unclear. 4, it is a precondition that for the application of this policy, the communists should have a party. I don't know that we all agree with that. That the EC thesis warns of the danger that the United Front policy will be used as a basis for reversion to an unorganized left in a broader fudge unity. Ooh, that hurts. Equally, as Trotsky put it, in the case where the Communist Party shall remain an organization of numerically insignificant minority, the question of its conduct on mass struggle front does not assume a decisive practical and organizational significance. In such conditions, mass actions remain under the leadership of the old organizations, which by reason of their powerful traditions continue to play a decisive role. And that last bit to
There it
me
is.
ends up actually saying that you're in it's not different than the Popular Front really anyway.
Well, it seems like that set of conditions apply to us right now. That like we don't have the kind of like workers' institutions like even on the level of like the confused clarity of the UK.
Well, there's one exception to that, though, Lexi. You're generally right, but the exception to that is that I'm assuming what Trotsky's saying here is that you remain under the old leadership of the Social Democratic Party. We don't even have that.
Yes, of course. There's always that.
Yeah, but you're at a low ed, but that's fair enough. That's fine.
So we should all enter the DSA, but destroy it. Is that what we're saying? Like, I don't know what we're saying. Like,
well, the DSA isn't Parliament, or isn't.
No, it's not.
It's
the
not like the
closest analogy
legislature.
we have, though. If we're going to take this thing seriously, that's the closest analogy we have.
Yeah, I mean, like the closest analogy is you would enter. You would all enter into the largest, least restrictive sect, right?
Right.
Which would be the DSA.
It would not be Marx's center, as it turns out, which I think is an interesting thing, because this taxes influence a chunk of the Marxist center. It would definitely lead you to DSA.
It would lead to the DSA. You would not try to, like, this is interesting, right? If you take this book seriously, all that base building stuff, like, where are you getting that from this?
You're not. And the smarter Marxist center people know that.
This leads me back to the abandonment point and what we actually see with the third period. And then I guess we can let Tom move us forward and talk about the problem of unity.
So this is the paragraph I wanted to do. So far they've had the split from the right, and then they've gone to United Front, and then they went to fighting with the Social Democrats, and now then they went to unity through self-censorship. And here we're going to end up a few years after all the split. Let's read this here. In fact, the Comintern went beyond unity through self-censorship and fudges to the concept of the anti-fascist People's Front. In doing so, they had decisively abandoned the early Comintern's concept, in which the United Workers' Front was opposed to the coalitionism of the German SPD and the French Cartel de Gauche. They had, indeed, begun to situate themselves on the terrain of the coalitionist strategy of the old right wing of the Second International. This meant, in turn, that they had begun to abandon the whole strategic line of Marxism as such. That is, that the only road to socialism is the self-emancipation of the working class as a class.
Which, by the way, I think every Marxist I know eventually seems to give up on that. So, like, I mean, I'm not going to call out anybody's name because, they're friends, but I do feel like I hear less and less talk about the working class as a class and more talk about the party as a party, the organizations as like neighborhood organizations or something. That's fascinatingly disturbing.
Yeah, that's a damn shame.
Well, I mean, it also indicates that Marxists don't believe it, like, in a real sense, that almost no Marxists actually believe in Marxism after certain, like, there seems to be a time of frustration where you just, the long view you start giving up on it, and God, I almost sound like a right winger saying this, but like, so you substitute all this other stuff for it.
This is why I think revolutionary Marxism needs to be rescued from Leninism in particular, because Leninism has the justification for the substitution of the party for the class. That's what it ends up really meaning. And to a degree, yes, it makes sense for the socialist nerds to think about their own agency, to figure out what they can do. And it kind of makes sense that a bunch of, reject managers or whatever would be able to organize an opposition and some kind of incursion into the legislature or something. And so it makes sense to have some kind of political orientation as, declassé or, petty bourgeoisie or whatever the nerds are. But in order to do that, and the whole reason that you should be doing that is in service to working class emancipation. and without that engine, there's not like
it's going nowhere.
Well, it's not even that it's going nowhere. There isn't like a lot of, there isn't something to collect these smaller sects.
It's probably worse than going nowhere. It's actually probably actively destructive.
Yeah, that's kind of what I meant.
It's not ridiculous to say that. Like, that's often thought of as a post-left sentiment. That's thought as, like a really, really, I don't know. It's thought of as being like anti-left. It's thought of as being super postmodern. But I think it's just empirically true. And if you're a real Marxist, you have to deal with it.
Yeah, so I want to read the next 2 paragraphs because I actually think they're useful. Why did this happen? In retrospect, Trotsky and the Trotskyists analyze these shifts as driven by the evolution of policy, in particular foreign policy of Soviet bureaucracy, and carried into effect the top-down bureaucratic control until the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the Comintern. However, since 1945, we have seen repeated examples of Trotskyist organizations performing the same flip-flops between unity on the basis of self-censorship, followed by sudden leftist shifts into third-period denunciations of right-wing workers' movements as purely bourgeois and sectarian isolation. Sectarian isolation can be equally found amongst a sudden shift into fudge unity on the basis of self-censorship. The evolution of the British SPD since 2000 has been a striking example. Also, see SALT and their on-again, off-again relationship with Democrats since the CWAT campaign. See also the ISO's entire history, forever and ever, amen. See also, including with the British SWP, and also weirdly in the last 5 years, all these parties seem to be dying anyway.
Good.
I don't know that I would want to believe it's good, but how they're dying is not great.
It's the same thing as like, oh God, when the Soviet Union comes down, then worker subjectivity will come back. After Gorbachev, then our turn.
Yeah. Oh God. I mean, like I'm thinking about this too with a real. Yeah, there's the reason why the ISO went under because of a rape scandal that we've all known about for like 6 years or 7 years. But the reason why it fell apart now is also because it was becoming a tiny organization, but its publishing wing was blowing up. And so parties that had real, when I say real money, I mean real money, like millions of dollars, making money off of the anti-Trump train, also began to zigzag in ways that made holding the party together, the tendency, it's not even a party, the organization together nearly impossible. So both its internal authoritarian weird structure that developed over time and its relationship to right-wing of the socialist movement and maybe the left wing of like not socialism ended up destroying it. And so this goes back to my whole question that I asked years ago. How come if anarchists, leftcom, Trotskyists are Maoists, you'll find organizations that all do the same things regardless. And they function the same, they do the same thing. So the ideological differences don't seem to matter. And that's worrying. And you even see this on the variety of positions on economic and foreign policy too. But
Derick, people they fall into the same stupid strategies all the time. They're not consistent. People are entirely not consistent. Who's consistent?
But that's not an answer, though. I mean, let's be clear. You're completely correct. I'm not arguing with that. And I'm not even saying, but the idea that it's all just our individual bad will.
I don't mean individual. I think that there are institutional prerogatives. There's lots of things that happen.
Well, yeah. So we actually agree.
In the general society.
We agree then.
And I think that
what's worrying is we're not overcoming those. We don't know what they are exactly.
I think if you look at it right now, we'll see the disintegration of a lot of these sects. At the same time, we're seeing the rise in interest in socialism and communism. And that is a positive thing. That these sects will go the way of the high bike when things start going. They will fall apart. Their members will drift into the DSA or into this one or the other one. I've just listened to a recent episode by that podcast, Regrettable Century, and they were ex-ISO by the sound of it, and they were talking about it, and they made a lot of points about how about the failings and how they expected it all to happen.
But I felt that because we lived through Lexi and I were part of a micro sect. They did the exact same thing, and then liquidated into literally the people you're talking to right now. And then to a minor caucus in the DSA that liquidated into another caucus in the DSA that liquidated itself about a year ago. So like this happens.
But this is not.
It's not bad,
but
but it's not.
It's not bad.
I don't know that it's a sign that the interest in socialism has not corresponded with the reemergence of a proper workers' movement yet. And that's something that I think, honestly, before this book could matter, we need a strategy book about how to deal with that.
I would like to see a labor organizing game theory book for workers. That's something I'd like to see.
Other than the ISOs, or not the ISOs, the IWWs. I'm getting my acronyms confused. There's so many, they're stupid.
If IWW is doing wobbly game theory, you show me.
It's not game theory, but they have and I know this from both talking to Wobblies and Wobbly was interviewed on a podcast. I can't remember which one, but they have a pretty well thought out manual as far as organizing the shop floor.
Yeah, and it works in very specific contexts in liberal cities, which admittedly, I'm not shitting on because the fact that they're doing anything at all after literally 60 years of basically being a remnant core organization that mostly existed for nostalgia, that's great. But it does, I went through listening to their stuff and I was like, so in a right to work state, you can do what exactly? If you're not large enough to literally armed insurrect against the state government. Not a lot. And they don't have any political agitation for changing the conditions in those states. Now, for our international audience, that's not relevant to them, but for America, that's huge. So it works if you're in Seattle or Portland or a place with, for whatever reason, even if they're kind of right-wing and scary, in the case of Oregon, has pretty good labor protections.
So this points to the necessity of a centrist strategy, because if you're interested in doing labor organizing in that context, you can't sit idly by when it comes to elections, even if there's a systematic distortion in those institutions.
Yeah, honestly, this is why I'm not a leftcom anymore.
Yeah.
Okay, let's read this last paragraph here and then we'll wrap it up for tonight because we're not going to finish this chapter tonight. We've been really chewing the cud on some of this stuff. So let me have a go and read it because my voice is so mellifluous. Okay. The truth is that the dynamic was not solely driven by Soviet bureaucracy and Stalinism as a particular caste political form, but also by internal contradictions in the early Comintern policy. The key contradiction is between the United Front struggle for unity on the basis of freedom of criticism and of party factional organization in the class movement as a whole, and the 1921 rejection of unity on the basis of freedom of criticism and of factions in the Communist Party as such. To see why, it's necessary to go a level deeper into the theoretical grounds for supposing that the United Class Front is necessary. So this is kind of getting to your thing a little bit, Derick. It's all of these different parties, whether they're Trotskyists or Maoists or even anarchists or stuff, they do all very similar type of stuff in the end. And sometimes it's not so much about their ideology, it's about other stuff.
I mean, one of the things when I was fighting for more democratic sects in the communist movement with Lexi and our microsect is we actually were trying to look at not so much the ideology of Trotskyists or Stalinists, but the voting structures and the holdover parts of what period of the Bolsheviks they were basing their voting structures off of, and all this. I mean, ultimately, I decided that it wasn't enough, but that really is an issue. For example, even the Trotskyists used the post-1921 Bolshevik voting structure for how they pick leadership, which is slate and open, and that wasn't the case before 1921. So they still use the Civil War standard, and the Trotskyist theory about that is ideology and leadership that's causing Stalinism to emerge, not the structure of it, which is why I'm so big on hitting on these structures, because I think it seems to be objective on most fronts that the Trotskyists are wrong about how they're different from Stalinists. That they are, but in some ways when the anarchists are yeah, but you would have done the same thing, the anarchists are kind of right. Oh man, it's going to make so many people mad at me. But whatever. Shout out to all the left comms out there, because in some ways I think you guys are more right than you think you are, but you're wrong about the most important thing.
Well, no, I mean it's worth saying the autonomists definitely distort Marxism in a way, but less than the other dominant traditions. Of
Well,
Marxism.
also, I'm not just autonomous.
Really?
Like, I think the Bordigas
Seriously.
have a lot of really important stuff to say too. They're just too damn Leninists for anybody.
Yeah, except they're Leninists, right? Yeah, yeah. Don't do that.
If it wasn't for that, they'd be awesome. No.
Right. If their defining characteristic was different,
Well, okay. This is we can actually have a long running about Bordigism, because the thing is, Bordigism it's invariant program aside. What's attractive about it seems to change on what period you're looking at what Bordiga's saying, because he's not consistent either. None of these people are as, like, except for maybe Marx and Engels, are all that particularly consistent. That's like the elephant in the room is like, you can quote every one of these people against themselves, right? Like, it's kind of maddening. Read this book and argue with it. Like, really put it to the test, because it seems this is one of the most fruitful books for talking about history, man. I mean, even if I come up thinking that it's wrong, I think it's been the most interestingly wrong book I've read in a long time.
Yeah, this is still one of the greats. All my criticisms, notwithstanding, I recommend this book to anyone that I don't think is going to drown in it.
All my criticism belong to us. All my base building belong to you. Okay. Oh, God. That was particularly for Sophie. Okay, let's go offline.
All right.
Ciao.
Bye.
Good night.
On this episode, you heard the theme tune, The Order of the Pharaonic Jesters, and The Night of the Purple Moon by Sunra and his orchestra. Thank you for listening. Please join me for the next episode of From Alpha to Omega. This show is a member of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast and research collective. Make sure to check out our network sister podcasts, General Intellect Unit and Swampside Chats.